Good evening, council members and commissioners. We are now live on YouTube. However, we are still waiting for Commissioner Stein to join us.
He just joined. Welcome everyone to tonight's virtual joint workshop of the Livermore City Council and Planning Commission at 5 p.m. January 20th, 2022. I'd like to call the meeting to order. And can we have a roll call, please, for both the Council and Planning Commission?
Councilmember Bonanno.
Here.
Councilmember Carling.
Here.
Councilmember Kick.
Here.
Vice Mayor Monroe.
Council member,
I apologize.
actually here.
And Mayor Warner.
Here.
Commissioner Branning.
Here.
Commissioner Leary.
Here.
Commissioner Stein.
Here.
Vice Chair Dunbar.
Here.
And Chair Anderson.
Here, but a quick correction. We have now Vice Chair Leary and Chair Dunbar.
Apologies. Thank you.
Okay, so everyone is here and we've got the positions corrected as well. So now is the opportunity for public comment to address the Council and Planning Commission only on the special meeting item. And as you know, how to participate is always at the end of the agenda. But at this point, could the city clerk please instruct the participants how they may participate to address us, please?
Yes, Mayor. During a special meeting, the City Council and Planning Commission provide an opportunity for the public to provide comments on agendized items. Agendized items allow the public to address the City Council and Planning Commission on each item of business it considers when the mayor opens public comment and should be focused on that particular item. Please note, a speaker is not required to answer any questions from the City Council or Planning Commission, and the City Council and Planning Commission are not required to answer questions from the public. However, the mayor has the discretion to ask staff to address a speaker's comments when a mayor or planning commissioner believes it is relevant to a particular business item. When participating in this portion of tonight's meeting, one comment may be given per person regarding only the special meeting item. Members of the public can participate by using the raise hand feature or *9 when calling in. Please raise your hand now if you would like to submit a public comment. Once public comment opens, each participant's name will be announced and their 3 minutes will begin upon being unmuted. The mayor will announce the conclusion of the public comment period after comments have been voiced into the record. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anybody who wishes to address us?
Honorable Mayor, yes, we do. Donna Caban, please unmute yourself.
Good evening, Donna Caban, Livermore resident. The city's housing element must be updated to meet the housing needs identified by ABAG and RENA for the 2023-2031 cycle. Livermore has been assigned 4,570 units. Of those, 2,075 are designated for low income and very low income. Livermore has already planned and approved 4,095 units for the Isabel specific plan, and another 4,000 units could be constructed at Vasco and McLaughlin adjacent to the planned Valley Link Rail. In addition to these two large planned housing developments, there are numerous plots within the city that could be redesignated for housing, such as the vacant Nob Hill Center, the Atrium Center near Rincon, to name a few. Livermore can meet its allocations if the city requires all housing developers to commit to low income and very low income housing units first, instead of allowing in lieu fees, which favors the developers, but not the workforce residents. Remember, the laws do not require the city to build all of these units, only identify where housing units could go. Some of the new state laws listed in the staff report, pages 3 and 4, are currently being challenged in multiple lawsuits and statewide initiatives. Because of these lawsuits and initiatives, which we don't know the outcome of, it would be premature to plan beyond 2031. It is very troubling why the General Plan Amendment Committee would consider an option of moving the North Livermore urban growth boundary outward when the city has more than enough planned units to meet the 2031 cycle. Moving the North Livermore UGB outward will not serve low-income and very low-income housing, as the cost of new infrastructure on undeveloped lands and away from transit centers would be too expensive for low-income or workforce housing units. This is not a county issue. Moving the North Livermore UGB outward would be determined by Livermore residents only. Plan for low-income and low-income housing units within the current city boundaries. And I have one question. Could the staff please supply a map of all the areas within city limits that could be used for infill housing and specifically for low-income housing? Thank you very much.
The next speaker is A.K. Burnham. A.K. Burnham, please unmute yourself.
Good evening. On November 21st, in response to PlaceWorks presentations, I wrote a multi-page document on my concerns about the previous housing element. And I haven't really gotten any feedback on it through the General Plan Amendment Committee. But anyway, the general point that I'm concerned about is that it was not obvious how decisions related to all the facts and figures that were presented. And I think that report is not very accessible to the general public. There were tables of lots of specific tracks, but as the previous speaker said, maps are really much more helpful when in trying to summarize what is available for what. And I'm hoping that the next housing element plan will actually be more comprehensible to the average citizen. And that concludes my comments.
And that was the last speaker.
Hey, thank you. Close the public comment period on item 3.1. And now we're ready for the staff report.
Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, Chairperson, and members of the Planning Commission. This is Mark Roberts, your City Manager. And I'd like to introduce Andy Ross, who's a Senior Planner, who will lead us through the first part of this presentation and introduce our consultant team. Andy?
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, and good evening, Mayor Warner, Council, Chair Dunbar, and Planning Commissioners. I would actually like to introduce Tricia Ponto, who's leading the housing element component of the general plan update. Tricia.
All right, thanks, Andy. Share my screen. Show me. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
To the slides. Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for being here for this overview of the housing element update. It's one of the required elements of our general plan, and this update is being done in coordination with the comprehensive general plan update. However, this element is a little unique. It has very specific intervals during which it needs to be updated and has very well-defined requirements about what needs to be in the housing element. And we'll discuss all of that tonight. So because of these requirements, this element is on a little bit of a different timeline than the rest of the general plan. We have tonight Amy Sinsheimer from PlaceWorks, who's part of our consultant team, who's going to walk you through the presentation. And then we also have members of our larger general plan team here tonight to answer questions.
Great. Good evening, everyone. This is Amy from PlaceWorks. Happy to be here. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So we're going to give an overview of the housing element. As Tricia said, it's a unique element within your general plan. It has some very specific requirements. We're going to talk about the regional housing needs allocation, which is the number that the city is required to plan for in terms of housing between now and 2031. We'll talk about some of the more recent changes to state housing law. We'll touch on the outreach that's been happening, as well as the project schedule. And then we'll mostly be focusing on any questions and discussion. Next slide, please. And next slide. So the state goes through a process every 8 years to have every jurisdiction in California update this element of the general plan. We're in what's called the 6th cycle of housing element updates. And the actual beginning of the period that we're planning for will be in about a year, January 31st, 2023. That's also the deadline for when housing elements in the Bay Area are due to the state. So you can see that time frame here. You can also see the time frame of your existing housing element that is currently adopted. This is a required element, and it is reviewed by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. They go through a pretty extensive process, and we work together with them, with the city staff, and we also consider comments received before and during that review process. The key piece that we've already heard some comments on is to accommodate the fair share of the regional housing need, and we'll touch a little bit more on the details of that. Next slide, please. So we're looking at where things were at in 2015 when you last updated your housing element compared to today in terms of the housing needs, the market. What do projections say moving forward? Definitely had various things happening during that time frame. We look at what land is available for housing. Are there sites that are in your current housing element that are still suitable, and where are there new opportunities in the city for this next time frame? We look at the city's regulations related to housing development in your development code and other parts of city plans. And we also look at how the market plays into the potential for housing development. And then we look for any constraints that may be posed by those things and craft programs to address them if needed. A new element of the housing element, or a new piece of the housing element that's required this round, is called the assessment of fair housing. And this is a piece where we specifically analyze any fair housing issues in the city based on demographic trends and community input. And then the implementation piece of your housing element, just like your other general plan elements, is goals, policies, and programs section, where we come up with how to address housing needs and goals in the city during the next planning period. Next slide, please. So the regional housing needs allocation, or the RHNA for short, is this number, and we can go to the next slide, that is allocated at the state level first. It's a very large number for this planning period. It's millions of housing units. And then that is spread out across all of the areas of the state to each city and county. And there's been a process that concluded in December of last year with the Association of Bay Area Governments, where each city and county received a final number to plan for. And as part of the housing element update, we look at opportunities and sites that can accommodate housing and are available should the amount of housing come forward during the planning period that's required. It's not considered a mandate to actually build units. Next slide, please. So this just shows graphically a little bit of the process. The number of units that was allocated to the whole Bay Area region is over 440,000. And the final RHNA allocation for Livermore for this next planning period is 4,570 units. You can see that's a pretty significant increase from the 2,729 for the current housing element cycle. Next slide, please. And here are the comparisons, both for the region and for the city. You can see pretty significant increases for both for the 6th cycle. Next slide, please. So there is a formula and quite a bit of parameters that the state requires when we're looking for suitable sites for housing in the housing element process. And one key piece is the RHNA is broken out into the different income groups that housing would be suitable for. So anywhere from lower income up to above moderate or market rate, folks who make enough money to afford market rate housing. And when we're looking for sites to accommodate those lower income units, so these are going to be higher density units, typically in areas that are considered metropolitan, which Livermore is, there is a threshold called a default density of 30 dwelling units to the acre that can be used in the housing element analysis. So when we look for sites for that part of the regional housing need, we look for sites that allow at least 30 dwelling units to the acre. Next slide, please. So here's a little more about the income groups and how the RHNA number is broken out between income groups. These income ranges are based on Alameda County numbers for 2021. And these numbers are updated annually, so there'll be new numbers coming out later this year. Next slide, please. So we've been working with the city to do the analysis for the first draft of the housing element. We're looking at sites that are suitable for housing. As I mentioned, we start with your current housing element and see where there are still sites that are available that haven't developed yet. And then when we're looking for new sites, and new ways to meet the RHNA, there are different approaches that can be taken, but two of the key things here are to look for sites that are between 1/2 an acre and 10 acres to address that higher density, lower income part of the RHNA. And this is based on state law and what's considered most feasible for higher density affordable projects. And then also looking at the potential for accessory dwelling units. And this is also something that the state provides guidance on, and we expect will be a part of the way that the city meets their RHNA number. Next slide, please. I want to touch a little bit on some of the newer state laws. I'm going to go fairly quickly and happy to take questions. There are quite a few listed here. So the first one, Assembly Bill 1397, is about what types of sites are suitable for meeting the RHNA, in particular the lower income RHNA. Senate Bill 166, this requires the city and all jurisdictions to monitor the sites that they include in their housing element and see if any of them develop over the course of the planning period. If sites do develop and there is a shortage of sites to address any particular income category, then additional sites must be added to the inventory. Senate Bill 35 and Senate Bill 330 both address streamlining of certain affordable projects and put into place requirements for how the city goes through the development review process with applicants for those types of projects. And they are both intended to streamline the process. Next slide, please. Assembly Bill 686. This is the law that went into effect in the last couple of years to add the analysis of fair housing into the housing element. And this does require taking a look at issues that may be a concern in certain parts of the city. So there's a geographic piece to the analysis. We also look at any historical trends that may contribute to any current fair housing issues that have been identified. This analysis is very unique to each jurisdiction. So we encourage input from the community on any fair housing issues or concerns. And then this will be addressed also when looking at the sites that are chosen for the housing element inventory and how those sites may interface with any fair housing issues. And it's important to not have them to exacerbate any of the fair housing issues. And then this is also addressed in the program section. Next slide, please. Next slide. So there's been a lot of outreach happening that has been part of the general plan update, and also targeted outreach related to the housing element itself. We did present to the General Plan Advisory Committee last fall to give them a similar presentation to what you're receiving tonight, to introduce the housing element part of the work. We did do one-on-one stakeholder interviews with different service providers and those who work in the housing field in Livermore to understand the current housing needs and concerns. There have been quite a few pop-up community events where we've asked for input on housing issues, and this photo is from one of those, I believe. The city did an open house at Owl's Landing to hear concerns from the residents there. There was also a virtual survey and a postcard survey to downtown service workers. And all of that, the summary of the input received will be included in the draft housing element and will inform the programs in the draft housing element. Next slide, please. And next slide. So this is just a snapshot of our schedule. We are shooting to have this element adopted by January of this coming year, January 2023, in order to meet the state deadline. And there are a lot of interim review processes and meetings, so there will be many other chances to engage. I think that is the last slide. Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. At this point, it comes back to us for questions and comments, and panelists, raise your hand and I'll recognize you as you go. Councilmember Monroe.
So I really appreciate the presentation and sort of followed this along as it goes. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, it's a large increase in Livermore. It's a large increase across the Bay Area and around the state. I'm wondering if you could speak to why such a large increase.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the most general answer is there's a housing supply issue in our state. That's, I believe, what the state would say in response to this, that not enough housing has been built for multiple decades. And we have a lot of people who can't afford many types of housing, a lot of people who can't afford to buy a home, people who are homeless. So addressing that overall issue. And then the specific change in the numbers on a more regional or local level has to do with changes in the characteristics of your particular community, whether it's access to transit and amenities, overcrowding or lack thereof in your existing housing stock, overpayment by people in your community, whether there are opportunities at all levels and price ranges or not. There are many things that go into the formula to come up with the numbers, but the overall reason is just not building enough housing for quite a while in our state.
I just wanted to make sure that was out there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to follow up before I recognize others. I think if you go back to the one slide, the ABAG region went up 135%. Livermore went up 67%. So we actually went up significantly less than the average for the region. And I think you should also look at our numbers compared to our neighboring cities. And I think the answer was, you really got to look into the details as to why this happened. So it's not globally there's pressures for increases, but why were the differences by region? And I think there's also indication that maybe how the allocation was done may need to be looked at, because remember, we didn't object, but all of our other Tri-Valley cities did. So there's a rich answer in that we're probably not going to go into tonight, but I just want to let people know that if they're interested, they really need to delve into the details pretty carefully.
I was just asking the simple question, but there is certainly a rich answer that could be given.
Right. Councilmember Kick.
I just don't want to let this moment go by and not recognize the fact that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. This is the first time we considered underhousing, where each room in a home, if it was occupied by more than 2 people, that was considered underhousing. And that is the first time we've ever considered that in this allocation, which is really important, especially when you think about the fact that BIPOC communities are more likely to be underhoused. So it's a better number count than we've had before, and therefore it's higher. And it's going to do a better job of righting the wrongs of redlining. So not gonna not say that when we have the opportunity that this is a good thing that the numbers are higher, because that means we're doing a better job of counting and talking about the problem.
Okay, Vice Mayor Bonanno.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I have a lot of questions about the new legislation, but I won't go. I mean, I just hard to understand how this will all play out. There's been a lot of challenges. There are some challenges already, and there's a lot of noise in the system about challenging some of these. I'm assuming that what we're going to do is stay the course on our planning. We're going to put together a good housing element, and we're going to be, doing our usual thorough and thoughtful effort on things like this, and we will end up with a housing element that I'm expecting to be compliant with these numbers, or I'm assuming that, and then we'll see how all these legal challenges play out. But I don't think we need to be distracted by them too much. And I guess I'd like to have staff comment on that maybe in a moment. And my only other simple question, I think, is I'm curious about the metropolitan jurisdiction and the associated default density. Livermore, what led Livermore, if you know, to be classified as a metropolitan jurisdiction as opposed to a suburban jurisdiction?
So Councilmember Bonanno, this is Paul Spence, your Community Development Director. I can answer the first question. You're correct. We are planning to move forward and identify appropriate sites for housing in the community consistent with the RENA allocation that we've been given here. We do believe, particularly with the planning that we've done the last few years, that we have appropriate sites available, and we'll be able to find appropriate sites within the city for a diverse range of housing types consistent with the requirements. So that is our approach. And of course, as time passes, if legislation changes or regulations change, we'll respond accordingly. And then perhaps PlaceWorks can give us an answer on the metropolitan question.
Yes, I'm happy to. So that is because Livermore is in a metropolitan statistical area. So if jurisdictions need to have a certain population and also be in a metropolitan statistical area in order to qualify for that default density as opposed to the suburban jurisdictions.
Can you, in simple terms, say what what was it, metropolitan? I forgot the term already. The statistical distribution for metropolitan areas or something?
A metropolitan statistical area is an area that has certain demographics that makes it more urban. And I would have to look up the more specifics of the definition, but basically it's the most urban areas of the state.
I just don't see Livermore that way. That's why I'm curious about it. But
I imagine that we're considered to be part of the Greater Bay Area.
Yeah, I was just wondering, are we just sort of the circles drawn?
Yeah, we discussed this at the GPAC meeting, and we looked up, all of the other cities in your area, and everybody's in this same category. Just for reference, places like Placer County also have this same default density, and they have some really rural areas. So it's not just the most urban of places.
Gotcha. Thank you. That I was just more curious than anything else. Thanks very much.
Chair Dunbar.
Thank you for the presentation. I will ask the law questions just a little bit, just so that the public has an understanding of some of the things we have to look at. Most of this mentioned the staff report, but could you speak a little bit to the concept of a buffer and in no net loss. We have this, we're planning for more than our allocation because of this to some degree, is my understanding.
Sure, yeah. So the goal is to identify enough sites and units to address more than just the RENA number, and the rule of thumb is 15% at least. And that is so that if you do have development that occurs on some of your housing element sites that isn't exactly how it's identified in the inventory in the element. So for example, if the unit count is lower on a site, or if the units are a different income category, then you have some buffer in your list of sites to address that change without having to rezone or identify more sites that are not already listed in your housing element.
So we'd have to make a hasty change if we didn't do that and something didn't.
Right, it's within 180 days if there are not already sites that have suitable zoning in the city that aren't in your housing element.
And then for AB 1397, which was in the report there as well, can you talk to what you mean by additional analysis required? That was in the presentation.
Sure, so if there are sites in the list in the housing element that are not vacant, so that's anything that has any use, really, including a parking lot, they need to be analyzed more than a vacant site. A vacant site, basically, the information that is needed is the density that's allowed, the general plan, the zoning information, how large it is. For a non-vacant site, the state wants to know, well, what's there now? Is it a viable use? Is the property owner interested in developing housing on that site? Is it larger than a half an acre or smaller than 10 acres? Is it in a good location for housing? And they really want kind of the story of that site. And in particular, if it's being used to meet the lower income RENA.
Thanks very much. I also, in terms of one comment is, I also noticed that we were going to require to build less than how much our neighbors' increase are, and also that the median incomes are really quite high, and so even low income is a fairly substantial income. My other comment was, if you could please, that last slide had a schedule of just the housing element, and the general plan website has an overview of the timeline, but it doesn't really break down the housing element part. If you could shorten that into the key parts of the housing element timeline and post that as well, I think it would be useful, sort of to some of the commenters earlier. Thanks.
Okay. Commissioner Branning.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I really appreciated it. First, a sort of comment question, and then a follow-up an actual question. The comment question I have, which I don't need an answer for right now, is just that looking at the RENA numbers and what we're working on, this really is, supposed to represent the need as well as the ability to build. And so seeing particularly the amount of need at the low and very low levels, I'm hoping as we're working on this plan, not just to find spots, but also trying to make sure we're incorporating in with the plan some ways of actually making sure that the units are built. So I hope we are looking into that along the process. My question is, I didn't see mention of SB 10, and I don't expect a full answer of if we're going to take advantage of SB 10 or not right now. My question would be, though, has the city looked into whether or not SB 10 would be appropriate for Livermore, and has begun at least begun analysis on whether or not it's an appropriate bill to take advantage of?
So this is Paul Spence, your Community Development Director. We are to answer your first comment question, we are looking at sites that we think are viable. We do understand the need, demand for housing. Our Isabel neighborhood specific plan includes a number of sites that we think may be pursued in the near future by developers. And certainly on the city side, we have an excellent track record of pursuing affordable projects that are city partnerships with our affordable housing nonprofits. In terms of SB 10, yes, we are looking at all of the legislation that's available, and we'll be evaluating that relative to the housing element. So seeing how that affects what we can do, and also talking to HCD, talking to the state about how they interpret the new legislation, and understanding how they're thinking that it will be applied and or counted against the housing element. And I don't know, Amy, do you have any other comments there?
I don't have any further information at this time now.
Commissioner Branning, this is City Attorney Jason Alcala. We are actually evaluating SB 10 as we speak, and just for you and the public and those who may not know, that's a new bill that was passed, and it allows for certain zoning changes to upzone the density of a parcel within a transit-rich area. And so we are looking through evaluating that now, and we'll be coordinating with planning staff.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Kick.
Kind of related, because SB 10 does talk about ADUs. I've heard a lot of cities talking about how they're going to rely on ADUs to do infill development, but that is not something that's easy to finance. And so, because it depends on the individual homeowner to then have wealth and money to build an ADU, or it's very difficult to get a loan. It's not like just getting a mortgage, not that that's easy, but it's harder to finance these smaller units. What are our conversations about how much we're going to be depending on ADUs in our numbers? And then if we are going to depend heavily on it, what's our follow-up plan to advocate for better financing, state, federal, or do we have other plans to make it easier for people to actually build those things that we say we have room for? I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, so this is Paul Spence again. We have worked to try to facilitate ADUs in our community through our zoning and land use regulations, through our building permit process, by allocating addresses to them, which we didn't do in the past, a number of things to try to make them viable independent units. We do, however, recognize that they are often not used for people to live in. They may be used for offices or playrooms or a variety of other things. So we're not looking to depend significantly on the ADUs as part of our housing element. I suspect that they will most likely be more of our background count. We talked earlier about needing to have additional capacity because individual projects may not achieve their stated requirements for low income or stated goals. And so your ADUs may provide some of that background capacity. So that, I think that's how we're approaching it this time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Councilmember Kick, this is Jason Alcala, your city attorney again. The state does continue to adopt new legislation, in particular when we deal with ADUs. SB 9, which took effect in January, as well as AB 345, address ADUs and how they can be used. There's a new development in the law, which is interesting. The AB 345 allows an accessory dwelling unit to be conveyed separate from the primary residence. So you could actually have two separate owners, one of the main dwelling and one of the accessory unit as well. So we're exploring that, number one, what the legislation says, and two, its foundation. But we are working through that in the city attorney's office and coordinating with the planning division and community development.
Thank you.
Commissioner Stein.
Yes, in regard to the public comment, as I see it, Livermore has three options in accommodating additional residential units. One is to increase density in existing residential areas for vacant parcels or redevelopment. The second is to convert commercial or industrial zoning to residential, as we've done, as was stated at Isabel and downtown and on Vasco Road. And the third is to go to the public to move the urban growth boundary. Do we have any input on what the public sees as preferential or sequential or simultaneous uses of those three options? I mean, there's been a lot of public outreach, and where do you see the public coming down on how they would like to see the additional residential units accommodated? And sort of as a segue to that, everybody says they want to maintain community character, and how do these three changes affect community character, and how does the public view community character?
So again, this is Paul Spence, your Community Development Director. We have been having conversations with the public. They have been more general in nature. They haven't necessarily drilled down to the level of detail that you're talking about here, but we certainly have heard consistent feedback that housing is a need within our community, that it's a need for people of all generations and walks of life to have affordable, good quality housing. And so that is a general comment. We are looking at a variety of alternatives in terms of how we provide that housing. Of course, we're looking at vacant residential sites. We're looking at a potential for conversion of commercial or industrial where those areas are underutilized or have not performed as expected. And then, of course, we're looking to have some higher density housing around future station areas. So that is our Isabel neighborhood. We're also going to be looking at the South Front area where Valley Link is planning an additional station. We don't think that we will need to go outside of the city boundary to meet our RHNA at this time. Hard to tell if that would be an issue in the more distant future, but we don't think we'll need to do that as part of this housing element. And Amy, do you have any additional feedback from the public outreach or any other comments there?
No, my concern is that generalizations get filtered through the consultant and the staff and the planning commission and the city council, and it may not accurately reflect the public sentiment. So, is there any way to drill down to some specifics?
I'll just say in response that, Director Spence is correct that there hasn't been outreach on the specific potential sites in the housing element at this point. It's more on the area-wide input as part of the general plan. So there will be an opportunity to give specific feedback once there's a draft housing element.
Thank you.
Before we go to Vice Chair Leary, I want to get a little more clear on this urban growth boundary. Or earlier, Mr. Spence, you said we were not doing that, or rather we were going to look within the city. And now you just said, we don't think we're going to have to go there. I would like to be crystal clear that we're not.
Yes.
We have no need to go outside the urban growth boundary. It's not under active consideration, and it's been blown out of proportion, some random comment. I just want to be clear.
You're absolutely right. We're not considering that. I was looking out into the distant future but
I know, but
there is no expectation of doing that in this cycle or any future cycle at this point.
Right. Well, well, let's just put it unambiguous. In this cycle, we are clearly not doing it. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So I just wanted for those who are listening and tend to write about this, that they're clear and correct. We're not going outside the urban growth boundary. We heard an earlier comment, public comment, that alluded to that as like it was a real possibility. I just want it one more time. We're not doing it. So understand that. And let's stop the false rumors. So now Commissioner Stein, you still have your hand up, but I think you had dropped it. Okay, so now we're to Vice Chair Leary.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I'm looking at page 19, and there it is, the schedule. Looks very tight. And so I'm kind of curious, just nuts and bolts, like what's coming next. And I can see that there's a draft housing element coming up in March and then April. So can you give us an idea of what that's going to look like? Is there plans, alternatives? Obviously, there'll be a narrative. What can we expect that to look like?
Yeah, I'll start, and then if the general plan team wants to jump in. So the housing element really focuses on the sites, to address the need that's been allocated to the city, programs related to housing of all types, any programs that address the housing issues in the city, and then the background report analysis, which supports all of that. The general plan process is, my understanding, is where you're looking at kind of the alternatives for where housing should go moving forward but as the staff has been mentioning for the housing element, so far we've been looking at, where housing is already allowed in the city. And I'll let Andy or anyone else follow up on that as well.
So Tricia, this is Paul Spence again. Perhaps Tricia, you could talk a little bit about the general plan outreach process. We're going to be looking at focus areas and how that ties into the housing element.
Right, yeah, so we will be looking at different focus areas and land use alternatives, analyzing a variety of uses in different focus areas as part of the general plan outreach and update. But like Amy was saying, we are really looking for this housing element cycle. We're looking at areas that we've already identified for housing in the existing general plan, the Isabel neighborhood specific plan, some of the other sites. One of the speakers earlier mentioned the Old Knob Hill site, Rincon and Pine site. So for this cycle, we're really focusing on stuff that we already have available. And then these focus areas and new maybe land use changes that come out of the general plan update will likely have more impact on future cycles.
The reason I asked that question, I see that like April, there'll be planning commission and city council review. It sounds like a lot of information would be reviewed at that time. And so any good plan with a schedule, we want to build in opportunities if there's going to be changes, because I see that after that, it goes all the way till December is the next time, right? Is there maybe in August another go around with that on the draft housing element?
Right, so I'll let Amy add to this, but we do have very strict deadlines with the state about when we need to get our draft housing element to them. And then there's some back and forth with them as they review and provide comments to us. And that is some new state legislation has really lengthened that timeframe. So we don't, and there are some rules about changes you can make once you've submitted your draft to HCD. So there is, like you said, there's very little time for us. And I'll let Amy speak more about how we can make changes between the draft and the final.
Yeah, I mean, changes are an option all the way until you adopt, but as Tricia mentioned, the requirements for making changes and then making the new draft available for comment, that has gotten much more strict since the law passed last fall. So anytime revisions are made and then a new draft is released for public review, there needs to be at least 10 days where that draft is available and comments can then be received and then additional revisions can be made. So I think Tricia's right. The schedule is fairly prescriptive in that way, but the opportunity to provide more input is definitely available. And, we'll leave it up to the city whether you want to hold more hearings or not.
Yeah, I can see that. So you're kind of locked in between June and October, right? With the reviews.
We do have the schedule is pretty much laid out if, in terms of meeting the deadline. But additional opportunities for input are definitely possible. It's not that we can't receive input during that time frame.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Larry, this is City Attorney Jason Alcala. As was mentioned, some of the new legislation that took effect in January, AB 215 being one of those, did increase the review time. It added an additional 40 days to the process, but in coming with that is an additional review that goes along with it. So there'll be public review during these processes as well.
Thank you.
Councilmember Monroe.
So first of all, let me just say that it's rare that I'm in a meeting with somebody who shares my name, and I'm finding myself just jumping every time Trisha's name comes up. So it's just, it's unique for me. I wanted to speak to Commissioner Stein's note about the reaching out to the community and making sure we get what the community believes. I very much agree with that, with the caveat. And the caveat is that one of the things that planning was my heaviest lift when I came onto council. It was, I came in with an expectation and an understanding about land use that was probably down to the 70s. I've learned an enormous amount since then, both about what it actually means to build a community, what a high building actually is. By the way, newsflash, 4 stories, not so much, just saying. How to make public land accessible, within the interior of a city, as well as what an urban, as well as keeping open space around a city. All of that, it's been a really deep dive and it's been really informative. In addition, I've learned a huge amount about how the regional planning takes place. I've learned about how affordable housing happens, and I'm new at this. All of which is to say that while I really, really want to know what Livermore residents want, I also want to be able to make sure that they understand at least some of what I've learned over this period of time so that they can make good decisions. Every day, it's slowed down a little bit now, but for the first year, every day brought some new revelation that was amazing. When Council Member Carling and I were working on the affordable housing piece of the equity and inclusion, we had the opportunity to work with some of Livermore's residents on explaining that to them. And again, got a sort of vision into how much information is out there and how complicated it is. So that's my little dissertation, but there is actually an ask there, and I don't even know if it's possible, which is there a way to have some way to make that piece, this knowledge available, accessible, so that our residents, I really believe, would like to understand this better. How is that possible? Is there, given our constraints of money, of time, and so on, any possibility of including some of that in this process?
So this is Paul Spence, your Community Development Director. We certainly do look to provide an educational component when we do public outreach, when we do pop-up events, when we do online meetings and the variety of things that we've been doing. We can certainly also look at the background that we're providing on the project website. If people want to do a deeper dive, we'll take a look at what we have there and try to provide as much as we can to help educate folks. But certainly we want our community to understand the variety of issues at play here and help them to make informed recommendations to us as they think about these things.
Great, thanks.
Chair Dunbar.
Thank you. Just adding on to that a little bit, the way I think about it is trade-offs. We have to present trade-offs to people. The state requires us to zone for this housing. There is no housing. It is just what type. And I know we have to start general, and I think we've done a decent job of that, but there will be a time to be more specific. I wanted to ask one more question, sort of be the good cop and the bad cop in one question. So I'll phrase it like this. Is it true that having a compliant housing element sets us up for state grants and funding?
Yes.
And is it also true that having a non-compliant housing element sets us up for state fines and other problems?
Yes.
That's all. Thank you.
Councilmember Kick.
I was very lucky to meet with someone from the Turner Housing Center yesterday and had a fantastic conversation. They're really happy to hear that Livermore is the only city in the Tri-Valley not suing about our RHNA numbers, and offered any help that we could possibly need. So, maybe a public presentation through the library with the Turner Center would be a good ask since I was offered it. So I will connect, later about that with our staff if they also think it was an offer. Trish asked, maybe it's a good opportunity. Because they are experts, they research this, and then it's not coming from us, it's coming from true experts in the community. Just putting that out there.
We would be happy to get that connection from you and contact them.
Okay, any other questions, comments? 'Cause I've got a couple, but then I would intend to wrap the meeting after that. So Vice Mayor Bonanno.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to really piggyback on what you said earlier. We're at the beginning of this. You guys are sort of getting the ground rules understood. And you're evaluating the new legislation, looking at our city footprint. And I think it's just really, really important that all of us are as crystal clear as we can. Noise grows very, very quickly in a system like this, where there's already a lot of noise about housing. It's not just in Livermore, but there are other issues in Livermore where we're just, we just need to be crystal clear. I'll just say it that simply about where we are, what's fact, what's noise. And I think we all, staff and those of us that are also elected and appointed out in the community, can do our very best to be knowledgeable, keep it simple, make sure people know what we know, but we don't need to speculate on other things. I just really think being as clear as we can and being, honest with people about where we're headed and what this is all about. We're just at the beginning. We don't even have a draft plan yet. So I think when we do, we'll have more to talk about. So I just want to close my comments with that and thank you all again. I know this is really hard work amongst a lot of projects that are really hard work. So thank you all on staff in particular very much.
Commissioner Stein.
Yes, first I'd like to thank staff and the consultant for the presentation. And second, traditional planning has sort of assumed that the past predicts the future. What we're seeing lately is it really doesn't. And for example, in mass transit, it's sort of a race between whether the riders come back before the federal life support ends. Other issues are human health, water availability, energy, a whole host of things. And I was wondering how those affect planning for housing. I mean, a lot of things on detailed design and also location and things like that. California's population for the first time in history decreased. And a lot of urban areas are losing population. So I was wondering how that affects planning for housing.
This is Amy. I'll just say that, we gather we gather current data. ABAG actually puts out a data packet that we can utilize for the background report for the housing element and look at some of those trends that you're talking about. Things like water. there is a requirement in the housing element to demonstrate that there is sufficient water and wastewater capacity to address the units that are being planned for. But it is, like you say, it's a moving target. So it's a somewhat of a snapshot in time when the housing element is prepared, and the actual projects that come forward, I think that's where you see more of the, figuring out what's going to work. But I'll let the staff respond on that as well.
Thank you.
So again, this is Paul Spence. I would concur that we'll take the best facts and information we have available. We use that information to identify appropriate housing sites as we go through and look at where housing may be needed for this next RENA cycle, and then as we go through specific planning for individual projects, we get more detailed. But we try to make sure that we have all the pieces in place generally to ensure that we're locating housing on appropriate sites that have access to water, to utilities, to nearby schools, and all the rest.
Okay, any other questions, comments? I'm gonna make a couple and then close. All right. I'm looking at, I want to go back to the schedule, and I think Vice Chair Leary kind of spoke to it. My concern or question, suggestion, however you want to think about it, with respect to the schedule is sort of goes around the question of how do we know as we do this that we're going to end up with a balanced community, and balancing amongst the various types of commercial housing and recreation. And in particular, I know that there's a need to help some of the service industries like auto repair, et cetera, that as they get displaced, will there be a place to put them? And so is there a time in this schedule where we can have a preliminary look that the overall general plan update is going to make sense? In other words, I'm concerned that some of the areas that we might convert from light industrial for the service are the areas where are really good for some of these businesses that say aren't necessarily appropriate for the downtown or where they're currently located. So where do we get a first look at whether the overall general plan context for which this housing element, that it all kind of makes sense?
So again, this is Paul Spence, your Community Development Director. We are embarking at the same time that we're working on this housing element component on public outreach around focus areas. We will also be looking at the variety of land use types that you have in the city. So commercial service is an example of a zoning category where we have a variety of uses that are service in nature, and we would look to see, for example, that we have how much of that we have, and if we're taking some away, we want to make sure that we've got enough to meet the needs within the community. The same for any other conversion. If we're converting light industrial or any other land use that is underutilized in a particular area, we will take a look at the total amount of that land use within the city, how it's broken up in districts throughout the city, and how it meets the overall need. So we do look carefully not to convert something that we'll miss later. So we do that as part of the overall general plan update process. And then we can look, as we bring the housing element back to you, to provide some of the context of that broader general plan analysis. It's not a requirement of the housing element itself, but we can certainly look to provide some of that to you concurrently.
Good. And what I'd like is this, if you go back to the slide with the schedule, I'd like that look at the overall for consistency placed on that schedule in a time that's consistent for it to matter. So if we were to look at, I don't know if you can do it now, but what we heard earlier is that, late August and beyond, we're kind of stuck here because we're sending it in for review. So that says that this overall consistency look has to happen when? June or when?
So your point in time consistency analysis would occur before you submit to HCD. So it's submitted to HCD in May. So we would give you that context at that point.
Well, wait a second. I just want to be sure. We're going to submit it in May. So the meetings to review it before it's submitted are in April.
Right.
So April is when you'll be bringing back to us the overall context consistency. And I'd like that put on the calendar where it says prepare draft environmental review. In that same time frame, we need the general plan consistency check.
And just to provide some context, the look that we would be providing to you is relative to the housing component that we're bringing forward at that point. We may be looking at additional details on land use in particular areas of the city that are not housing related as part of our ongoing general plan discussions. We might be looking at other pieces. We won't have the rest of it all wrapped up in April, just to provide the context. But
not all of it, but in particular, my question is centered on these service businesses. Do we have enough allocated such that when we look at some of those that are where they're currently located, we're going to have to move them?
Very good.
Right? So with respect to that particular one, do we have, after we do the housing element that's proposed, do we have enough prime locations for these other businesses? Just to make sure we're not going to be precluding these service industries as a result of the action we're taking.
Very good. We'll look at the potential loss and its distribution and provide that information to you.
And then the only thing that follows on, are there any other key commercial sectors in which we have to be sensitive? But I think right now, we can easily look, especially in the downtown area, at some of these businesses that we know could be better located elsewhere, and that those areas could be converted to housing. And that's what even some of the current zoning is for. So is this going to make sense for that one business sector? But do a quick look to see if there are any other sectors that we should be concerned about.
Very good. We will look at loss in every sector and give you a report back on that.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions, comments? Again, I think we're all thanking you for the report. It's going to be very helpful. And we can see a lot of work to be done in not a long time. So we'll thank you for what you've done so far. And I think we're all ready to have whatever meetings you need to have with us to advance the ball here. So any other comments? Okay, we're now going to adjourn to a regular city council meeting on January 24th, 2022 at 7 p.m. and a planning commission meeting on February 1st, 2022 at 7 p.m., both held virtually using Zoom. So thank you all. And